To be a successful medieval king, you must have been an excellent military leader, adept at dealing with disputes in court, and also display a certain degree of fairness throughout your kingdom. Edward II's reign as King of England is known for being a rather awful period in English history, in which the country saw many military defeats, was plagued by a crisis in government, and was also plagued by civil war. Today, Edward II is considered one of England's worst kings due to his over-reliance on his favourite advisors such as Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser, who are even considered by some to have been the king's lovers. However, Edward II's death is a shocking event, as is the deaths of all monarchs. So join us today as we look at the brutal murder of King Edward II, and remember to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Edward II was born in Caernarfon Castle in Wales in 1284, being the child of Edward I and Eleanor of Castile. Edward I is known today for being a brutal military leader who led a number of successful campaigns, and he is considered to have been a key figure in medieval history for his castle building and battles. Edward I consciously made the decision to move his wife and Queen Eleanor to Caernarfon in Wales before her son was born, in order to join Wales and England together. If the Welsh saw a king's son as being born in Wales, it would help ally the countries, as Edward I had conquered large swathes of Wales at the time. Edward II was born within the walls of Caernarfon Castle, and at the age of 16 in 1301, he would become the first English prince to hold the title, the Prince of Wales, in an elaborate ceremony which is still performed today. Edward II had a normal upbringing for a member of the royal family, and he was interested in horses and dogs, but shunned activities such as hunting, which was very popular in the 14th century. He enjoyed music, but was banned from taking part in jousting at tournaments for his own safety. He was a tall and well-built young man, and was a rather confident public speaker, and mixed with the working class as well as the upper class. This attracted criticism at the time, but he was presented the Manor of Eltham by the Bishop of Durham in 1305, which during Edward's life he would make big changes to. He is considered by many to have been homosexual due to his devotion he showed his favourites, including a rumoured lover named Piers Gaveston. Gaveston appeared in Edward's circle, and Edward even asked his father Edward I to award him a title, and the king at the time was so furious he threatened to disinherit his son. Edward's father the king would die on the 7th of July 1307 after mobilising an army against Scotland, and following this Edward travelled to London, and on the 20th of July was proclaimed king. One of his first acts was to recall Piers Gaveston to his court, and the next year the new king would marry the 12-year-old Isabella of France, who was a daughter of Philip IV. Edward was older, being around 23, but their marriage was an attempt to resolve problems and tensions between England and France. The marriage would produce 4 children, however Edward continued to dote on his favourites, leaving his queen neglected. Piers Gaveston in particular was showered in gifts and titles, becoming the Earl of Cornwall, and he began to insult many of the most powerful barons across England. He even called the Earl of Warwick the Black Hound of Arden, to which the Earl responded with, "One day the hound will bite him." Edward II particularly liked to dress Piers, and their relationship was labelled as a sin against nature and as a love beyond the love of women. One chronicler even wrote of the two, upon looking on Gaveston, Edward immediately felt such love for him. Gaveston would later be captured after he fled the country, and would settle at Scarborough Castle. However, a number of barons were given the responsibility of capturing him, and they would be successful. This was a ploy to attempt to force the king's hand into giving in to the barons' demands, but Gaveston would be held at Warwick Castle and condemned to death. He was then taken out of the castle to nearby woodland, where 2 Welshmen ran through him with a sword and brutally beheaded him. With Edward's ally dead, infamous Scottish hero Robert the Bruce began to spot a weakness. He had lost much of his kingdom during the reign of Edward I, however the Scottish began to try and take their land back. In 1314, Edward II led an army north to stop the advancing Scottish army. Robert the Bruce had already recaptured most of the castles in Scotland held by Edward, and had even advanced into northern England. Edward II planned a huge military campaign, raising a 20,000 strong army. This would then result in the huge Battle of Bannockburn. The battle began on the 23rd of June 1314, and was a horrific and notorious loss for the English king. The English were packed tight and were routed in devastating fashion, with the army being forced to flee by the devastating Scots. Edward himself was even forced to run back and was chased by the Scottish. Edward later, following the defeat, seemingly did not learn from the mistakes of the past involving Gaveston. He acquired another favourite, Hugh Despenser, who was given large amounts of land and became close to the king. Hugh was showered in titles also, and yet again the nobles were angered, but Despenser was a very greedy man, who was referred to as the second king. At this time, relations between the French and English had also deteriorated, and the king's queen Isabella was sent to France to pay homage to her brother, the French king, and here she would plot instead against her husband Edward, whom she hated. Isabella's actions shocked the French king, and on the 24th of September 1326, Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer the Earl of March, invaded England. They were joined in their army with many of England's nobles who were unhappy with their king Edward. Edward would try to rally London, but in a desperate attempt he fled and was later captured. Isabella had managed to capture and besiege cities, and Edward, her husband, was forced to abdicate, leaving the throne to his 14-year-old son Edward. In the bloody aftermath, Hugh Despenser was executed, being hung, drawn and quartered, with Bible verses etched on his skin, and his father was also hacked to pieces and fed to local dogs. The brutality didn't stop there, as King Edward II was imprisoned first at Caernarfon Castle, but later moved to Berkeley Castle in early 1327. It was here in which the King of England would become a victim of regicide and would never leave the confines of his cell. Edward was moved to Berkeley as it was believed to be more secure, and it's unclear how well he was looked after. Records show that he was brought luxury goods, however other chroniclers suggest how he was mistreated and kept in horrific conditions. These accounts suggest he was kept in a dark and damp dungeon and was left to stew in filthy conditions, with rotting animals sharing his cell. With this, it was hoped that he would contract disease and die of these causes rather than being murdered in cold blood and having his captors being responsible for this. Edward, as he was a fit man, did seem to survive this treatment and get through this, but there are different accounts of how Edward died. How the former king died was never officially stated, but on the 23rd of September 1327, Edward III was told that his father had passed away a few days before, around the 21st in the night. Most historians believe that he did die on that date, however some do consider that he died later. Some historians even consider that he could have been broken out of prison and fled to Europe, but the circumstances of his murder are rather murky. The common story of Edward II's death and murder is that in cold blood, on the orders of his wife Isabella and her lover Mortimer, that Edward was murdered in horrific fashion. It's believed that inside his cell, an assassin snuck in the middle of the night and murdered him, using a red-hot poker and shoving this up his backside, slashing his entrails to bits and therefore stabbing him to death. The people of the castle were said to have heard piercing and agonising screams from the king's chamber that evening, whilst hearing his screaming as he passed away. It was said that screams could be heard for miles away. This rumour began to circulate during the 1330s and 1340s, and although no evidence of being true, it's claimed that this could have been propaganda used against the late king. It's a matter of what you believe, of course, when you consider Edward II's death. His method of murder was never officially stated and mentioned, and it could be easily a figment of the imagination of 14th century chroniclers, the story with the red-hot poker. Some sources say how Edward just died at Berkeley Castle, without saying how, and also others say he died of natural causes, and that he was alive in the morning, but dead by the evening. Another says how he died of illness, and another also says how he died of sorrow and melancholy. One of the most interesting accounts says how he was murdered by a trick, or that he was killed either by suffocation, strangulation, or a natural death, or by violence by others. One account, written by the son of a man who knew the late king, said how he died by what matter was not known, but God knows it. There is another idea, that Edward in fact was freed somehow from captivity, and this arises from the fact an Italian bishop wrote to Edward III, saying that his father had escaped from Berkeley Castle, and had arrived at Caernarfon Castle, and then later travelled on to visit the Pope, and in fact he now lived as a hermit. In Germany it would later arise that a man who claimed to have been the King of England's father visited Edward III whilst he was in Germany, and the man who called himself William the Welshman wasn't executed for being a pretender, but instead spent time with King Edward III. The truth behind Edward II's death is highly debatable, and it's up to you what you consider to be the truth and what in fact is a myth. What can't be denied though is that during his kingship and reign over England, he made many enemies and was a poor king who trusted the wrong people and placed too much faith in a select few. Whether you believe the hot poker story or that he possibly escaped, that is really up to your opinion. However, the death of a king in any circumstance is incredibly shocking and really does solidify medieval England as a barbaric place to have lived. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.